You know what's more entertaining than watching two politicians agree with each other in the comments? Absolutely nothing, because it never happens. But you know what's even better? Watching a Home Secretary absolutely eviscerate a Green MP for hypocrisy in front of the entire chamber, while said Green MP is accusing her of pandering to the far right. That's peak Westminster theater, and that's exactly what happened yesterday when Shabana Mahmood and Carla went toe-to-toe over Labour's asylum reforms. Mahmood didn't just defend her policies. She went nuclear, calling out the Greens for talking a big game about compassion while opposing asylum accommodation in their own constituencies. The comments erupted. Denier was shouting back, and the whole thing was captured for posterity. Welcome back to UK Political Insight, and today we're breaking down one of the most explosive parliamentary clashes in recent memory, where the Home Secretary said she couldn't care less what other parties think, accused the Greens of being absolute hypocrites, and basically told everyone that pretending there isn't a problem with asylum is what's fueling division in the first place. Buckle up, because this one is absolutely spicy. Alright, so let's set the scene. Shabana Mahmood is standing in the Commons presenting Labour's new asylum reforms. We're talking about a package of measures designed to deter migrants from seeking asylum in the UK and make it easier to remove people who don't have the right to be here. Strong stuff, the kind of proposals that immediately get people fired up on both sides. Mahmood's pick is that Britain's asylum offer is too generous compared to other European countries. It's pulling people toward our shores, and British taxpayers think the system feels out of control and unfair. She's not mincing words. She's saying the uncomfortable truth, her words, is that we need to tighten things up or the whole system collapses under its own weight. Enter Carla, Green MP for Bristol Central, who clearly decided this was her moment to make a stand. And fair play to her, she came out swinging. Denier stood up and said it's not people seeking sanctuary that are tearing the country apart, it's toxic racist narratives and the scapegoating of migrants and asylum seekers for things that have nothing to do with them. She said the chronic housing crisis and the running down of public services aren't caused by migrants, they're caused by political decisions and grotesque inequality. Then she landed what she thought was the killer blow. She accused Mahmood of trying to out-reform reform, suggesting Labour is boosting baseless far-right narratives and deepening divisions when the country needs leadership and hope instead. Boom, mic drop. Except Mahmood wasn't having any of it. Mahmood's response was absolutely withering. She said, and I quote, "I couldn't care less what any other political party has to say about these matters." Just straight up dismissed the entire question. Not in a defensive way, not in a politicians dodging the issue way, but in a genuinely couldn't give a toss way. She said she cares about the fact that she has an important job to do and she can see there's a problem that needs fixing. She said if it was possible to pretend there wasn't a problem, she wouldn't be saying there is one, but there is a genuine problem in the asylum system and it needs someone to sort it out, not pretend it doesn't exist. And then she twisted the knife. She said pretending the problem doesn't exist is one of the things that fuels division in the first place, basically telling Denier that the Green approach of denial and wishful thinking is actually making things worse. But she wasn't done. Oh no. Mahmood then went for the jugular. She said it's Green Party politicians who are absolute hypocrites because they talk great language in the Commons, but then oppose asylum accommodation in their own constituencies. Absolute hypocrites. She said it right there on the floor of the House of Commons. That's not a subtle dig. That's not reading between the lines. That's a full-throated accusation of hypocrisy aimed directly at the Greens. And the reaction was immediate. Carla could be seen shouting back, absolutely furious. The chamber erupted. This wasn't polite parliamentary disagreement. This was a proper row, the kind where you can feel the tension through the screen. Let's unpack why this hit so hard. Because Mahmood's accusation isn't just theater, it's based on a real pattern. The Greens, both as a party and as individual MPs and councillors, have a track record of supporting asylum seekers in principle while opposing specific asylum accommodation projects in their own areas. It's the ultimate NIMBY move, not in my backyard. They'll stand up in Parliament or on Twitter and talk about how we need to be compassionate, how we need to welcome refugees, how opposition to asylum seekers is racist and xenophobic. But then when the government or local council says, right, we're going to house asylum seekers in this hotel or this building in your constituency, suddenly there are concerns about local infrastructure, about consultation processes, about whether the facility is appropriate. It's having your cake and eating it. It's virtue signaling without accepting any of the practical consequences. And Mahmood called him out on it, publicly, brutally, in front of the entire Commons. That's why Denier reacted so viscerally, because it's true, and she knows it's true, and now everyone else knows it's true. The Greens can't claim the moral high ground on asylum if they're opposing accommodation in their own backyards. It's rank hypocrisy, and Mahmood wasn't going to let it slide. She basically said, "You don't get to lecture me about compassion and leadership when you won't even accept asylum seekers in your own constituencies." That's a devastating line of attack, and there's no good rebuttal to it. Now, let's talk about Denier's original accusation because it's worth engaging with. She said Labour is trying to out-reform reform, implying that by taking a tough line on asylum, Labour is pandering to far-right narratives. This is a common criticism from the left. The argument goes that by talking about border control, by talking about the system being broken, by proposing measures to deter asylum seekers, you're legitimizing xenophobia. You're accepting the framing of the far right. You're making migrants the scapegoat for problems caused by austerity, inequality, and political failure. And there's some truth to that. When politicians talk about asylum seekers as a burden, as a problem to be solved, it can feed into narratives that dehumanize them and fuel hostility. But Mahmood's counterargument is also compelling. She's saying there is a genuine problem. The system is overwhelmed, it's expensive, it's slow, it's not working for anyone, including the asylum seekers stuck in limbo for years, and pretending that problem doesn't exist is politically unsustainable. If Labour refuses to acknowledge public concerns about immigration and asylum, if they dismiss those concerns as racist or far-right, they're going to lose voters to parties like Reform who will acknowledge those concerns and offer much harsher solutions. Mahmood is arguing that the only way to preserve public support for asylum is to demonstrate that the system is under control, that it's fair, that it's not being abused. If voters think the system is chaotic and unfair, asylum support collapses, and then you get genuinely draconian policies. She's positioning her tough measures as actually protecting the principle of asylum in the long run. You can agree or disagree with that logic, but it's not the same as pandering to the far right. Mahmood is saying she's being pragmatic, that she's facing reality, that she's trying to fix a broken system before public anger makes things even worse. Denier is saying that by adopting tough rhetoric and policies, Labour is fueling division and scapegoating migrants. They're both talking past each other to some extent, but Mahmood has the advantage of being in government and having to actually deal with the consequences of an action. Denier has the luxury of opposition, where you can take principled stands without worrying about electoral or practical realities. The housing crisis point Denier made is interesting, though. She's absolutely right that the housing crisis isn't caused by migrants. Britain has a chronic undersupply of housing caused by decades of underbuilding, restrictive planning laws, and a failure to invest in social housing. Blaming asylum seekers for that is ridiculous. They're a tiny fraction of overall demand. The same goes for public services. The NHS is struggling because of funding decisions, workforce shortages, and systemic issues, not because asylum seekers are overwhelming it. Denier is right to push back against narratives that scapegoat migrants for problems that have much deeper causes. But here's where Mahmood has a point. Even if asylum seekers aren't causing the housing crisis or the strain on public services, if the public perceives a connection, that perception matters politically. If people in struggling communities see new arrivals getting housed in hotels, while there are local people on housing waiting lists for years, that breeds resentment. Fair or not, justified or not, that resentment is real. And if politicians ignore it or dismiss it as racism, that resentment festers and becomes something much uglier. Mahmood is arguing that the only way to maintain a generous asylum system is to make sure it's managed in a way that brings the public along. That means being honest about challenges, being tough on abuse, and making sure the system is seen as fair. The out-reform accusation is a bit rich coming from the Greens, because they've been eating into Labour's left flank for months now. They've welcomed 5 Labour councillor defections just recently. Their membership has exploded to 180,000. They're positioning themselves as the real progressive alternative to Labour. So when Denier accuses Labour of chasing reform voters, it's a bit hypocritical. The Greens are actively trying to poach Labour voters by positioning Labour as not left-wing enough. Labour is trying to hold together a coalition that includes both socially liberal metropolitan voters and more socially conservative working-class voters in post-industrial towns. That's incredibly difficult. Attacking them for trying to appeal to both is a bit rich when the Greens are cherry-picking the left-wing metropolitan voters for themselves. Mahmood's line about not caring what other parties think is also revealing. She's basically saying, I'm in government, I have to make decisions, I have to deal with the real world, and I'm not going to be lectured by opposition parties who don't have to face those trade-offs. It's a confident position, some would say arrogant, but it also reflects frustration. The Greens get to take the purest line because they don't have to govern. They don't have to balance competing priorities. They don't have to worry about losing voters in Stoke or Sunderland. They're positioning themselves as the moral conscience of the left without facing any electoral consequences for it. Mahmood is saying, I don't have that luxury. The hypocrisy accusation about asylum accommodation is where this really gets nasty, though. Because Mahmood is right. There are documented cases of Green councillors and activists opposing asylum accommodation in their own areas. Sometimes it's dressed up in concerns about the suitability of the accommodation or the lack of local services. Sometimes it's about consultation processes. But the effect is the same. Rhetoric about welcoming refugees, followed by opposition when it comes to actually housing them locally. That's textbook NIMBYism, and it completely undermines the Greens' moral authority on this issue. The near's furious reaction suggests Mahmood hit a nerve. When politicians shout back instead of calmly rebutting an accusation, it usually means they know the accusation has truth to it